this thing called life. What is your life going to be once you're not at work every day?
Sometimes folks retire too early and they don't do the calculations. They don't figure out how they're going to make up the rest of their income. You know, $50,000 in today's dollars is not the same as $50,000. It doesn't spend the same as 20 years from now. Planning for retirement when you have a pension is actually much more complicated than a lot of folks think.
Some states, if your income is very high, you may contribute to your spouse's nursing home bill every single month.
So in today's video, we'll be examining a critical retirement mistake that keeps countless people working years longer than necessary, and that's misunderstanding the hidden costs of pension benefits or other guaranteed income sources. Now, through analyzing hundreds of retirement plans and doing tons of pension calculations, I've discovered that most people dramatically underestimate how much retirement income their pensions can provide when claimed strategically. Now, and that's exactly why we're making this video today, to show you why pensions or other guaranteed income sources like your Social Security, or even if you have an annuity, are far more powerful than really most people realize, and why delaying pension claims could actually cost hundreds of thousands in lost benefits, and how to determine the optimal claiming strategy for your specific situation.
Yep.
Boy, that's a big one, Todd.
That is a big one. And we're just talking about a few $100,000.
It's only a few $100,000, right?
Yeah.
You know, and I think depending on the numbers, it could be more or less than that.
Sure.
However, the point is that this stuff is really worth thinking about, and it's really worth planning around. So what goes into some of these calculations? That's what we need to talk about here a little bit. And what are some of the challenges with delaying or claiming too soon? And when we talk about pensions, they vary in size and shape and flexibility. And, you know, I think we need to include in this conversation claiming Social Security. And if you have other guaranteed income sources or want other guaranteed income sources, these are things like annuities, right? Mm-hmm. A pension is effectively an annuity. Social Security acts like an annuity. Okay. Sure. Mm-hmm. It doesn't mean annuities are good or bad. You know, private annuities are good or bad. But they're very, very popular financial instruments. And so if we don't talk about them, then what we find is that folks end up making poor decisions, and then I have to try to fix it later on, and that's frustrating.
That's not good.
Because we want to make the right choice at the front. Mm-hmm. And so, you know, when we're thinking about these, there's really two ways to look at this, right? And I've seen people do one or the other, sometimes both. But we want to take every piece of this into consideration.
Sure.
Sometimes folks are going to look at, okay, what's the net present value of these income streams? You know, and if you're an engineer and you're watching this, you're like, yeah, that's what we want to do. Let's get the right discount rate here. Let's do the net present value. We'll calculate my mortality based on it. And you're like, okay, you got the numbers exactly right. And so the folks, tends to be like two different errors that people make. Mm-hmm. These are broad. One is those types of folks. They're doing the net present value calculation. They've got all this figured out to a T. And what they haven't thought about typically is like, what are we going to do when we retire? You know, it's some of the softer.
This thing called life. What is your life going to be once you're not at work every day?
Yeah, and what do you want to do?
Yeah,
and but there's a real opportunity cost in that, right? You know, I'll give you an example. I had a client who engineering type person, and had the numbers down, had it down to a science, had the whole thing planned out. We're good to age 9. You know. Pretty well, right? We missed a couple things on tax on Social Security and some of these other little issues. Only a couple $100,000 between friends, right? The problem was what he didn't anticipate was that he was going to get sick, and so waited too long to claim benefits because wanted a really high number to make sure all the stuff worked. Didn't end up getting to enjoy it, and I know you've seen that a ton on the estate planning side.
All the time.
Oversaving for a rainy day, and the rainy day never comes.
Yeah. People come in all the time, and they're older and they've scrimped and saved, planning on stuff, and then Fred has a stroke and can't travel and spends all of his time at home and can't leave home. That's a huge kink in the works right there.
And especially, And I'm not giving any pension claiming advice, okay? This is general information, but imagine in that situation that they elected the pension that doesn't have a survivor benefit. This is tough, if we don't have a way to fund that, the rest of that, these can be challenges. These can be really interesting challenges. And so, one area where people make mistakes is they do all the math, but they don't take into account there's life that happens in between then, and they try to get to a certain number. Sometimes that's pre-tax, and we've got tax considerations that are significant in these that aren't being taken into account. On the other side of things, sometimes folks retire too early and they don't do the calculations. They don't figure out how they're going to make up the rest of their income. $50,000 in today's dollars is not the same as $50,000. It doesn't spend the same as 20 years from now.
Oh, it's half.
Yeah. This is a problem. We need to be able to adjust for inflation and be able to maneuver some of this. And so, planning for retirement when you have a pension is actually much more complicated than a lot of folks think. And we haven't even discussed the option of a lump sum potentially in those situations, and depending on what the interest rates are at the time, how they determine what that lump sum buyout would be, that's a whole other challenge, And so one takeaway from this is simply that, determining how to claim your pension is a lot more complicated than folks realize. And truly the benefit folks that are at the company, they're probably nice, but they're not supposed to be giving you specific advice, and if it's like a TIAA or that kind of company, those reps work for the company. And so they're incentivized to make sure that you take the option that's best for the company. That's not in your best interest, 99 out of 100 times, in our opinion, right? And so you want to make sure that you work with an independent fiduciary advisor to make sure, CFP preferably, to make sure that we're not missing anything, because there's a lot of details here. So if you're watching this video and you've got maybe pension options, you're not sure when to claim your Social Security, you may have other sources of guaranteed income, but you don't know how to coordinate them all and bring them all together, click the link in the description, fill out the quiz quickly. We'll talk about our methodology, how we approach this, and we'll give you some ideas about how you can potentially increase your income and save some money on taxes. But we'll talk a little bit more about taxes as we get back into the video. Now, we haven't talked yet about taxes in this scenario. One of the downsides of pensions, traditional pensions, is that they're taxed as ordinary income. And I hardly hear anyone talk about this. This is a huge problem. Now, on one hand, great, we have a guaranteed lifetime income that, unless the pension fund has a problem, is going to, and that's a whole issue, which does happen, by the way, quite a bit, is going to keep coming in until you die, and if you have spousal continuation, until they die. That provides a tremendous amount of certainty for people. Mm-hmm. One of the advantages of pensions is that behaviorally, people enjoy their retirement more. We've done whole shows on this. Mm-hmm. People enjoy their retirement more when they have guaranteed lifetime income that comes in that they're not worried about running out of.
Sure.
Makes sense.
Mm-hmm.
The problem is, with a traditional pension, it's taxed as ordinary income, which, depending on the size of the pension, can make your Social Security income also taxable. So, I have clients who are both teachers, got great teacher pensions, and they, and in some cases even have Social Security as well. They're bringing home $6,000, $7,000, $8,000 a month each. Great. The after-tax amount is significantly lower than that.
Hurts.
And in some cases, they're not always adjusted for inflation. And so, we can run out a month before we run out of money in the long run if we're not careful.
Sure.
With these. And the truth is, tax rates are probably not going down in the future for folks that are in those higher earnings brackets. And so we can end up running into problems from a tax planning perspective if we don't plan around it. Now, the hard part is some pensions we don't have any choice. We just don't. Mm-hmm. And so,
they are what they are.
They are what they are. And we've got to take what we can get, and it's better than nothing, right? But if you're someone who you have a pension and you have a lump sum option, you really want to pay attention, and you want to be doing some strategic planning around this, particularly at the time that we're recording this video. Because if your lump sum buyout is going to be able to, let's say you went to a private annuity company to be able to get your own pension, hang with me, that's going to transition the lump sum into an IRA. Now, with an IRA, different than a traditional pension, we can do a Roth conversion. We can pay the tax on that IRA. Mm-hmm. And if we create a a privatized pension, something similar to a privatized pension through a private insurance company, a private annuity, that income can be tax-free, which would make your Social Security less likely to be included in your taxable income.
That's cool.
So I've seen some really cool scenarios where, the lump sum could actually create as much or more income than the traditional pension. It's not every time, but it's worth exploring. And if we can do strategic Roth conversions, get that income tax-free, oh man, that could be hundreds of thousands of dollars, truly, not without exaggeration, over your lifetime, in just money that would have been lost to taxes.
And particularly right now when interest rates are higher and companies are offering some substantial bonuses, increases, for signing up with them. So there's a lot of cool products out there. And then again, I always require that we bring up long-term care.
Yep. This is a huge piece.
Because that comes into play because income is treated differently than assets. And in some states, if your income is very high, you may contribute to your spouse's nursing home bill every single month. And so income is important, and you do have to look out for it. And not thinking about long-term care is a huge mistake. And I find a lot of financial advisors and even some attorneys, they don't bring up long-term care. And man, it's the looming, as we call it, the white shark out there that is circling and could be a huge issue.
Well, and it's not fun to talk about long-term care.
Nope.
It's not fun to talk about annuities. Long-term care and annuities have, in some ways, earned their reputation.
Sure.
I think both of those products and strategies, there's lots of different products. We're not talking specific products, but they're earning more popularity. We're seeing a lot of these more and more and more, and so if we don't talk about them, we're not doing the right thing for our clients, and so we have to take that into consideration. I love that you bring up the fact that if someone has to go into the nursing home, and depending on the state, that income gets, the way that I think about it is that income is getting lost to the state.
It is.
And so if we're doing planning early on, we want to take that into consideration when we think about things like health. In the case of that client that I told you about, yeah, he's got a great pension. It's not going to the spouse, and it's going to the nursing home. Like he planned everything right to get the maximum benefit, but it didn't benefit his family. Right. It's benefiting the nursing home. And so if we don't talk about how these things are interrelated and we plan early, there can be huge lost opportunities. That's a tricky one, and that's a sneaky one that you wouldn't think of.
Right, and I think that's why our relationship is so special in that in a meeting with a client, you and I both bring that in. And you can't have a good, solid plan unless you have both financial and legal coming together to meet your needs. And rarely does anyone get that, particularly in one meeting. But a lot of people never get it at all because those two people never talk to each other. They're both busy or they're territorial or whatever. And those two professionals never come together, but we do that every day in our office.
And that coordination is tough, without having the same level of, interaction that we have, and so we've got to make sure we get all of this stuff thought through together. Another thing that sometimes folks don't take into consideration when we're thinking about pensions is inflation. That's another issue. Not all pensions get a cost of living adjustment. And so if you're doing a pension evaluation and doing calculations, we got to understand what those rules are and whether or not that's going to happen. And that influences the lump sum calculation. And so, we want to think about all of those different pieces. And so I think what's important is we need to remember that retirement runs on income. And so we need to do good income planning and think about all of the details here. And what we find is that a lot of folks just use the company or think they've got it figured out when there's other details that they've never heard that can affect these things that we've got to take into consideration. And so, we have tools that can do this analysis. There's lots of different tools that can do this analysis. What we find is that the tools that the company provides are pretty minimal. they're not typically going to take things like inflation into consideration, taxes into consideration, the other assets that you have. And so, it might look good on the company scenario, but they're making estimates that maybe aren't realistic for the rest of your life. And so having a customized income plan put together, especially if you have a pension or other guaranteed income sources that you're going to be relying on to create income for the rest of your life, really consider talking to a fiduciary CFP advisor who's going to be able to take into account all of these details. And we'd be honored to do that as a second opinion if that would be helpful. So now that you understand some of the true value of the details behind claiming your pension benefits and the potential cost of delaying or taking those too early, you can make a little bit more of an informed decision about your retirement timing. But if you're looking to get some help on this piece or your whole retirement plan, fill out the questionnaire. You'll answer a few questions. It's pretty general, but we'll send you a video back analyzing your specific situation and showing you exactly how to maximize your income, minimize taxes in your retirement so you can retire with confidence. We look forward to seeing you in the next video.